The Old Plank Road. Lowell Parker, writing in the Arizona Republic 15 years ago, had this to say under the heading, "You wouldn't want to travel this way now." Quote, "It was far from being a superhighway like its present day successor, Interstate 8. It was called the Plank Road, a unique section of portable wooden pavement within the length of the Spanish Trail, which in years gone by was a haphazard route that served as the only direct link for motor vehicles between Yuma and San Diego. Old-timers remember that plank road well, as part of a long, hot, frequently dangerous journey from the desert east of California to the Pacific coast. More like a beach city's seaside boardwalk than a highway, only 8 feet wide at the most. It served its purpose of getting wayfarers over the worst part of the high, constantly moving sand dunes of the Algodones Range. That dune range, miles in width, begins in Mexico and extends northward almost to the Salton Sea. Even today, its bare yellow hillsides, always shifting because of strong winds, present a frightening, awesome vista to the uninitiated motorist. At first, the roadway was constructed of planks fastened lengthwise to rails. Later, railroad ties were strapped together with steel bands. It was completed in 1914 and for 12 years served as the only roadway between Yuma and Southern California. In 1926, highway engineers were able to lay down a hard surface roadway close alongside the old plank trail. Today, Interstate 8 parallels the original route. But, like the old road, even it is almost overwhelmed by nature's savagery. Bits and pieces of the plank road still can be found at intervals near the interstate, but through the years, most of the old road has disappeared. Surviving, of course, are the legends. My mother, in fact, was one of those legends, although for much of my life I was not completely aware of the circumstances. One of my earliest recollections, reinforced by old Kodachrome slides from the 1930s, is of my sisters and me stumbling across sand dunes to reach what our dad would call the old plank road. We would be sailing along the highway on one of the family's trips to Southern California and Arizona when, unexpectedly, Dad would pull off the road and herd us out of the car and across the sand to stand on a decrepit but still mostly intact wooden roadway, partly buried by the sand. He was clearly fascinated by it, telling us about how it was, until 10 or 12 years ago, the only highway. Mother had nothing to add. As usual, she let Dad do the talking. This scene was repeated perhaps a half dozen times over the years of my childhood. Always Dad doing the telling. Always we children listening with decreasing patience. Always Mother standing silently, placidly by. Later, in our adult years, we heard all of the story. The cross-country courtship of Wells and Daphne, our parents. How they met in 1919 during a college summer session in Madison, Wisconsin. How he completed medical school and moved to Denver. How she finished college and moved to Norfolk, Virginia. Sporadic, infrequent letters were exchanged. How he moved on to Southern Oregon in 1924. How she drove with a friend the following year across the country to Pasadena, where her 2 aunts lived. 2 young women alone in a 1925 Chevy, carrying a pistol for protection, including on their route the length of the old plank road. It was that trip which brought her close enough for occasional visits. How Dad drove 1,000 miles each way on partly unpaved roads to see her. How finally, unable to endure any more such trips, he summoned all of his courage and proposed. They were married on Christmas Eve, 1925, in Fowler, California, where her sister Marion lived. No wonder Dad was so intrigued by the old road, insisted on returning there with us when we were young. But it was Mother who traveled the road. Why wasn't she the one telling the stories? Why was she so silent? I don't remember noticing on her face, but I think now she must have had just the slightest little smile of satisfaction on the occasion of those family visits. An adventure successfully accomplished, a plan brought to completion as only a woman could manage it. I recall her story a few years ago, including it in a poem called Strangers. The quote is from Hebrews. Do not neglect to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. My mother, once a Wisconsin lass, later a cross-country vagabond in search of the right man. She knew who she was. She knew who he was. She just had to catch up with him. Never failed to do the right thing, but strangers had a way of putting her off. Though I remember once when she and I were driving to Nebraska to rejoin Dad, she picked up a scary stranger, lean and burned by the midsummer sun. A hitchhiker who helped drive most of that day, excuse me, till we let him off near Lincoln. It wasn't like her at all. She didn't say a word about it after, and I knew better than to ask. This was a woman who once packed a handgun, traveling across the Arizona desert in search of that right man. Sometimes it seemed as though we were all strangers, or perhaps angels unawares. This past summer, going through all the old things in my parents' house, I came across an envelope labeled in Dad's printing, The Old Plank Road. Inside were several ancient pictures of the road, as well as a couple of recent articles about it. And resting heavy at the bottom of the envelope, a rusty 7-inch spike, obviously taken from the roadbed on one of our visits from 60 years ago. Finally, a small note in Dad's unmistakable writing. The Old Plank Road between Yuma and El Centro. Daphne and Margaret Hoffman traveled this in 1925 in a Chevrolet coupe on the way to California. After such pioneering and adventure, what could I do but marry the girl? The end. I got through it. Thank you. Yay.
Beautiful. Voice stayed strong.
And there's the birthday man.